I'm sure you've heard this word recently, performative. And you've wondered, what is that though? Why is everybody using the word performative lately?
The thing is, performance within society is a normal thing to a specific degree. However, a performative male has one goal in mind.
And also the associated noun, performativity. What do these words mean? That's what I want to talk about today, and I'm also going to give you a bit of the history behind these terms, and hopefully next time you can use it yourself or decide not to use it because you're a free person and you have free will. I took my glasses off because they were so dirty I could barely see the camera I'm speaking into. The term performative is primarily associated with a book called How to Do Things with Words. And I am very sure that people are still buying that book thinking it's like a manual in how to speak persuasively or whatever. It's not. It's a book in the philosophy of language, and because of that, it treats fundamental questions about our language. And the question it deals with is, how are we to understand that part of language use for which we cannot apply the true-false distinction? When I say it is raining outside, my statement is true or false. If I say Napoleon lost the Battle of Jena, then that statement is true or false. But if I say, please give me your pencil, or if I say, shut that door behind you, that statement is not true or false. What is it then? Because clearly they can go wrong. For example, I can say to someone, please shut that door behind you, after they had already shut the door. So initially, Austin makes this distinction between constitutives, the language used by means of which we mean to reflect the world and to which we apply this true-false distinction, and performatives. It is very important, we're going to talk about why he gave up this eventually, but it is very important to note already, because of the connotations of the word performative, which is easily associated with performance, that Austin did not mean to say that when I tell you to close the door, I'm engaged in some theatrical performance. He did not mean performance, the root perform in performative, to mean that. When I say, please close the door, or please give me a glass of water, or whatever, I am performing some actions. I'm not performing a play. I am performing what will later be called a speech act. But by the way, How to Do Things with Words is a series of lectures, so you see his thought unfolding. It is a beautiful work to read. It is very easy to understand. It hardly contains any sort of philosophical baggage, so I really recommend it. But by the third or fourth lecture, he realized, but wait a second. When we affirm something, when we say something, we're also performing the act of, let's say, describing. And Austin arrives at what will become the fundamental insight in what is called now speech act theory, or what will later be called speech act theory, which is that whenever we use language, there are conditions of satisfaction. So just as there are conditions of satisfaction for affirming something, describing reality, explaining, so on and so forth, there are conditions of satisfaction for promising, or giving orders, or threatening, or issuing a sentence in a court of law, or saying I do at the marriage ceremony, so on and so forth.
And so on and so on.
But the point is that whenever we use language, this language use is evaluated in terms of its felicity, as he called it, its appropriateness, its correctness, because there are conditions for language use. In other words, all language is performative. Every time we do things with words, that doing is a matter of performing. And then Austin gives many examples, some very conventionalized, like in institutional settings where there are prototypical ways of saying or doing things, and some less conventionalized, like even something like a promise has conditions of satisfaction. For example, I cannot promise something in the past. I cannot promise that Napoleon won the Battle of Jena. Right? So this is where the book ends. Now, the speech act theory and this speech act approach in philosophy of language continued with a very important philosopher whose name is John Searle. And he wrote in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, I think How to Do Things with Words was in 1958. And Speech Acts is in 1969. I'll put it on the screen. It doesn't matter if I'm wrong. Anyway, so he wrote a book called Speech Acts, in which he tried to go against the grain of what Austin was trying to do, because Austin was not trying to put forward a theory. He was just exploring very reflectively this part of our interaction, linguistic interaction. But Searle is very much a theorist. So he said, okay, but it's not all that messy. It's not speech acts and conventions and forms of performance just flying about. So we associate nowadays John Searle with a theory of speech acts. So he systematized the conditions. He said, okay, there are this and that types of conditions, some of which were already mentioned by Austin, but he made it a bit more systematic. He also proposed the typology of speech acts, meaning that even though there's a multitude of many different contexts in which speech acts differ slightly, you can boil them down to 4 or I think 5 categories. I think directives, assertives, commissives, expressives, and declaratives. Those are the 5 categories. So this is the first meaning, the original meaning of the term performative. Performative is just how we do things with words. In order for me to threaten you, I have to fulfill certain conditions of performance. Language is performative, and therefore meaning is performative, if you say it like this. It just means that in order for me to understand what you are saying, you have to engage in this partially conventionalized activity.
I have come to the conclusion that the basic unit of meaning, if I may so speak, is the speech act. That what we are looking for when we ask such things as, what did he mean by that, is precisely into those intentions with which his utterance was performed. That is to say, what kind of speech act was he performing?
Now from this original meaning, which is, again, not very connected to performance in a theatrical kind of showy sense, we move towards, we can move in different directions. On the one hand, performative came to be called into question. For example, a French philosopher by the name of Jacques Derrida called into question this basic assumption that you have a context with rules, and if you conform to rules, you do things. It seems a crazy thing to criticize, but he wants to say that the repeatability of contexts is not that simple. Not that things don't repeat, but we have to be very careful in assuming that we have this stable pockets of meaning that we can bring into a context as simply as that. So one trajectory is the critique on speech act theory. Another trajectory is the adoption and continuation of this use in anthropology. So when you start a research, an empirical research on, I don't know, some tribe, some undiscovered tribe somewhere, you will very quickly notice that a lot hinges on various performances, we would say various rituals. So you see here, performative means exactly that theatrical, hyper-conventionalized, showy aspect of human action. And anthropologists are very interested in the meaning of these performances. So when the indigenous tribe is doing the rain dance, what does it mean? How does it end up being that what it is in a society? So what is its constitutive history? It is all very interesting, but it is very much not connected to the original. And the third strand, and by the way, I'm not entirely sure that these strands are completely independent of each other, but in a third strand, you could look at the work of Judith Butler, a very famous contemporary philosopher, and her work on body and gender. I think Gender, Trouble, and Bodies That Matter are the two main works on this. And performativity is extended here to materials, and more specifically to the stuff, the material of our body. She famously reflects on the idea of gender in that it is not something that is an essence that you have inside. Somebody is essentially almost like their soul is male or female. But she says, well, gender is a matter of bodily movement repeated under certain norms. So we would say gender is constructed by this performance of repeating certain actions under certain norms. But in fact, and I think this constitutes the interesting philosophical point that Butler is making. Unfortunately, as you may know, these two books were caught up in the whole gender debate, and they ended up being political books. And I think it's unfortunate. I mean, it's maybe good that the discussion is occurring, but I think the philosophical quality of these books is thereby forgotten. An important aspect that Butler brings to attention is that what we tend to see as stable, hard facts of reality, capital R, are in fact, at least to some degree, constructed by our experience. In other words, that materiality does not precede performance, but it is some sort of intricate relationship with it. Of course, she doesn't deny the existence of hard facts, although, by the way, there are other postmodern philosophers of science, for instance, who might. She doesn't deny the existence of hard facts, but she shows that what we recognize as, for example, two separate bodies, or two bodies that are separated by a certain distinction, or that we place on the foreground and are on the forefront when we look at someone or when we understand someone. All of these are very complex, intricate societal processes, and they don't necessarily rest on a bedrock of these are the facts of the matter. Sometimes they do. With some things, I mean, for example, I perceive reality right now, and I have all the reasons in the world to think that this perception is generated by some object outside me. This is not the type of claim Butler seeks to counter. Rather, first, when looking at gender, she wants to say that gender is performative, not in the sense that it is a show, not in the sense that it is theatrical, not in the sense that it is, I think at one point she says, put on, like you would put on a mask, but rather that performance is constitutive of someone's gender. And I think this also alternatively raises the question of subjectivity. In other words, me, the core of myself. What is that? I think a lot of philosophers, especially from Hume onwards, as you may know, Hume famously said that there is no such thing as the self. Self is just a bundle of perceptions. I think Butler raises important questions about what exactly it means to be a self. And her answer, again, I'm simplifying a bit, is that the self is a bit a la Hume, not like an essence, a Platonic idea or something of that sort, but it's rather constituted through these repeated actions, repeated performances. A self, if you want, is a bundle of iterated performances. Tiny little micro performances, but very important nonetheless. So let me summarize before I turn to something I think is very important. at the core, in the beginning, performative was this neutral aspect of language use. We understand each other because we do things with words according to conditions, and we notice those conditions primarily when they fail to be fulfilled. Then you have more the critique of that, so an entire discussion on what is context, what is meaning, do we really have a stable context, can we really speak of stable meaning? You have the anthropologists who go in the proverbial rainforest and talk to the tribes and are interested in the meaning created by specific performances. The plural is usually used there. And then you have the third strand where we take categories that we tend to see as essentialists. So someone is really essentially a female or someone is really essentially a male. And we show that what's underneath them is iteration of norms through repetition. You're just slowly, socially building at it as opposed to expressing it, something that is inside or reflecting it when it is inside. Now, it is very, very important to highlight that this attempt to see performance as constitutive of something is nowadays being turned over almost against the initial meaning of Austin and even Butler, and I think to some degree even the anthropologists. Because nowadays, when you think of how people use the term performative when they speak of someone as a performative male or a performative female, the performative male is, I think generally, I think this is a bit of a Gen Z vocabulary. I might not understand it very well, but I think a performative male is someone who is very much an ally of feminists. They're very much allies of, I think they're called, isn't this the whole macha male? It's the wordplay on macho male and macha male. So the performative male is performing what females and feminists want to see in a female, in a male, and the performative male is thereby somehow mischievous, somehow unrighteous, somehow trying to trick. So all of a sudden, to call something performative has a negative connotation. Whereas I said many times that that negative connotation is not there in the original philosophical work. So if I call you a performative male because I want to say that you are faking an alliance with, let's say, female and feminist movement, I'm accusing you of something. A performative male is not a very kind label to carry. Another example is when people describe activities. So you might have heard the phrase performative activism or performative allyship. That's almost like saying that's not real activism. When you say someone is engaged in performative allyship, you're kind of saying that is fake allyship. And notice, again, I'm sorry that I insist, but I think this is very important to have clarified. Austin was not describing misleadingness. He was not describing fakery. He was describing efficiency. If you want to promise something efficiently, that thing needs to be about the future. I cannot promise that Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo or Jena or something that I said, right? So performative male and performative activism. Nowadays, this carries a negative connotation, and it is almost like an insult you use for someone who is being misleading, or who's being fake, or who's being showy. So the performative nowadays has a very clear negative meaning. And I'm not sure how this evolved. Maybe linguists or someone more interested or more knowledgeable on this account can tell us in the comments. But philosophically, this is a bit of a piracy, because this is not what the term originally meant. Now, language is free to evolve. I'm not a purist. I'm not saying it is wrong to use it like this, but it is definitely not in line with the original philosophical context. Let me know what you think about all this, and maybe you've heard uses of the term performative and performativity that I missed, and I will answer all of your questions in the comments section. Thank you very much.
Yeah.